Hey, middle schoolers, welcome to JOLT on our YouTube channel, our teaching for this Wednesday. We're in the second week of a series called Worth It. And last week we looked at the first week of the series and we talked about how the Jesus who suffers with us. And so this is week 2 of this Worth It series. And I've been thinking about just some stories of when I was growing up. And I remember when I was like in 3rd grade or 4th grade, somewhere in there, I remember getting a new bike. Now, this wasn't just any bike. This was like my first stunt bike. It had like pegs on the tires and the seat was like this hard plastic. It wasn't some like cushiony thing that like little kids use with training wheels. This was like the bike, and it was everything I had ever wanted in a bike. It was like this sick like white and gray pattern. It was like the coolest stunt bike ever. And I remember it was like everything I'd ever wanted in a bike. And then I tried to ride it. And for some reason, it was harder to ride than the little kid's bike that I'd been using. And I remember getting so frustrated, and I'd ride, and it felt uncomfortable, and the seat hurt, and I didn't really know how to ride it. And I got so frustrated that I remember that I threw the bike down in our front yard, and I kicked it, and I walked away. I remember being so frustrated because I couldn't ride this bike, and I kept failing, and I kept getting so frustrated. And then I remember my dad. Some of you know him. Actually, he's your small group leader. I remember my dad coming and helping me. I remember him saying, "Hey, we don't need to kick the bike." And I remember him helping. We set the bike up and he kind of talked me through some things. And I remember him helping me be able to ride this bike. Or I remember the number of times when I was in middle school, and I remember the number of times that I was at home trying to figure out my homework, and it just didn't make sense, and I couldn't get it. It didn't connect. It didn't click in my head. I would try to do this homework, and it didn't make sense. And I wonder if some of you are experiencing a little bit of that right now, since everything is homework, because all of school is now at home. And I remember these moments of being so frustrated that I just couldn't figure it out. And then what would usually happen is one of my parents, usually again my dad, he would come and look at the math problem or the history thing where I'd been failing over and over and over. And with a little help from him, some pushing in the right direction, I would figure it out. And it felt so good. Those moments when you're doing schoolwork and it clicks and you get it. How many of you know those times when you understand, when you get, those times when you get what you need. I don't even know exactly what I'm talking about. There are times in our life when what we need, it's more than just someone who understands our pain. It's more than someone who suffers with us. There are times when what we need is someone to come alongside us and help us out of our failure. Now, last week we looked at how it's amazing that Jesus comforts and cares for us even when we're actually the ones that have caused the suffering. Through our own bad choices, we're the ones that have caused the suffering. But the truth is that when we screw up, sometimes we need more than just God's comfort and understanding. Sometimes we need God's help. And that's the power of Easter. Now, Easter was this last Sunday, but middle schoolers, Easter isn't just a one-day thing. Actually, the season of Easter, it lasts in a church world and church calendar for a whole week. It's this 8 days of celebration, and the mentality of Easter is an all-the-time thing that we can carry around. But Easter isn't just a one-day thing. In the power of Easter is that our story doesn't end with our suffering, that there's hope. One of the first Christians, a guy named Paul, he spoke about this a lot because for the first Christians, some of them, a few decades after the resurrection had happened, a few decades after Jesus had risen from the dead, some of the first Christians were struggling to believe it. They had this sense like, how do we know that Jesus' resurrection from the dead is any more real than like Easter bunnies? Like, what if the resurrection of Jesus actually didn't happen? And if it never happened, then does our faith mean anything? And is there really power in the gospel? Like, if Jesus stayed dead, is following Jesus or his teachings even worth it? You see, we're not the first people to ask these kinds of questions. People that the first Christians were talking to were wrestling with these very same kinds of issues. And again, one of the first Christians, a guy named Paul, he wrote this letter to help these first Christians understand that the resurrection really happened and that it happened and that it changes everything. So if you have a Bible around you, I want to invite you to go pause this, go grab it. All right, we're gonna look at the book of 1 Corinthians. So pause this right here. If you don't have a Bible, we're going to be in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. And in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, Paul says this. 1 Corinthians 15, starting in verse 1. Now, brothers and sisters, I want to remind you of the gospel I preached to you, which you received and on which you have taken your stand. By this gospel you are saved, if you hold firmly to the word I preached to you. Otherwise, you have believed in vain. For what I received I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Peter and then to the 12. So now Paul isn't like throwing punches here. He's not like sugarcoating stuff. He's not going easy on people. He says that if the resurrection never happened, like if Jesus didn't really rise from the dead, if the resurrection never happened, Paul essentially says that, look, this Jesus stuff, you're wasting your time. If the resurrection never happened, this Jesus stuff is pointless. And then look at what he says a little bit on. Move down a little bit to verse 12. He says, but if it is preached that Christ has been raised from the dead, how can some of you say there is no resurrection of the dead? If there is no resurrection of the dead, then not even Christ has been raised. And if Christ has not been raised, our preaching is useless, and so is your faith. Okay, now, this can feel a little confusing or fuzzy or frustrating when you read it or when you listen to it. What Paul is saying is that if the resurrection never happened, if Jesus never came back to life, then our faith is meaningless. Now here's why this is such a big deal. Here's why this dude Paul is so amped up about this. If Jesus never rose from the dead, then there's no power that can free us from sin. You see, Jesus didn't just come to suffer so he could comfort us and understand when we suffer, when our sin leads to suffering. Like, he didn't just come so he could comfort us. When Jesus suffered and died to give us a way out of our suffering, both now and forever. Because of our sins, we hurt ourselves, we hurt others, we hurt God. And in our own power, we can't make that right. But because of God's power, because of resurrection, our sins can be forgiven. Without resurrection, we're stuck in our sins, both now and forever. The resurrection of Jesus is the key to Christianity. It's the key to everything. If Jesus was simply like a good teacher, if he was just like some dude who did miracles, if he was just like a nice guy who suffered and died and then stayed dead, then following Jesus would be pointless. But that's not what happened. Jesus suffered and died, and then 3 days after his death, Jesus opened his eyes and stepped out of his grave, and that moment changed everything. It changed everything for you. It changed everything for me. Because of the resurrection, if you trust and follow Jesus, the Jesus who lives now lives in you. Because of resurrection, if you follow Jesus, the Jesus who now lives in you. The truth, my middle schoolers, is that we need Jesus' power to conquer sin and death. Because for as long as we live, we'll continue to see sin and death in our lives. Sin is constantly causing pain and destruction. Sin is constantly causing diseases and sickness, like the things that are causing us to be quarantined right now. Those things are a result of the fact that the world is broken, that there's sin in the world. The world is broken, it's fallen. Sin is constantly causing pain and destruction. When someone hurts us, it's easy to see how their sin has caused us pain. But it's not always easy to see how our sin causes pain, perhaps to others. Think about it. Ask yourself, can you name the last time your sin caused you pain? When did your choices lead to negative consequences? Now, can you name the last time that your sin caused someone else pain? Either like intentionally or accidentally. Think about that for a moment. Can you think of a time when your sin maybe caused someone else pain, accidentally or intentionally? Can you name the last time your sin caused God pain? The truth is that we all have sin in our lives. And the power of Easter is that we can have forgiveness and new life through the resurrection of Jesus. The sin, the stuff in our life, it doesn't have to control us any longer because of Jesus. So, middle schoolers, the next time you find yourself experiencing difficulty or pain or loss, perhaps because of your own choices, or maybe through no fault of your own, first, I hope you'll remember that the Jesus who suffers with you. And then that the Jesus who lives in you. This Easter season, I hope that you're convinced more than ever that to Jesus, you are worth it. I pray that Jesus will always be worth it to you too. Grace and peace, middle schoolers.